Are we better off trying to forget painful and potentially divisive memories? Do we get along better when we avoid opening old wounds? Why is it often so difficult to work through the past, and what are the potential benefits of doing so? These are the questions we explore in Realms of Memory. I'm your host, Rick Dudarian, and in today's episode, we turn to the memory of the Great Exodus from China. With the communist victory in China in 1949, nearly 1 million Civil War refugees flooded into Taiwan, one of the largest outmigrations of Chinese people in the modern era. What role has memory played in the struggle of these mainlanders to come to terms with being uprooted from their ancestral home in China? How has the memory work of first and later generations of mainlanders helped them find a new home in Taiwan? How does this memory work help us to understand the relationship between trauma and memory in new ways? To explore these questions, I'm very pleased to welcome Dominic Meng Xuan Yang, Associate Professor of History at the University of Missouri, to discuss his book, The Great Exodus from China: Trauma, Memory, and Identity in Modern Taiwan. Dominic, thank you for taking part in this episode of Realms of Memory.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick, for the invitation.
So we started before this introduction talking about how little that this great exodus has been studied. And given the magnitude, it really hasn't been until about the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question, Rick. I mean, it is a very important question, a question that I discuss in detail in chapter 1 of the book. Just to put it very simply, it is a kind of topic that, this is not to say that people don't ever mention it, right? If you go and read any books on modern Taiwan or the Chinese Civil War, there is always going to be that mentioning that, hey, by the way, 1 to 2 million people from different parts of China went to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek's regime. And that will be it. The biggest field scholarship that is related to this topic is the discussion of Chinese Civil War, right, or the Chinese Revolution. So it could be discussed as part of the Chinese Civil War, or part of the Chinese Revolution, but too bad. East Asian studies specialists are much more interested in, when they talk about 1949, they are more interested in the Chinese Revolution. They are more interested in people who remain in China, and they're more interested in what happened to China, in China, in Mao's China after 1945. And the idea of the Chinese Civil War itself as a sort of a competition of the revolutionary regimes or visions between these two self-proclaimed revolutionary party in modern Chinese history, that being the communists and the Chinese nationalists, right? So, I mean, that's always been part of the reason. I mean, the dominating question in that scholarship, the scholarship of the Chinese Civil War, has always been, why did the Chinese communists won despite all its disadvantages? Why did the nationalists lose the Civil War despite the support of the United States, despite gaining all the prestige following World War II, defeating Japan?
So this story, the human dimension of the Great Exodus, really has been largely ignored until recently. But if you look at it, It seems to be that one of the main arguments of your book, the main argument, is that we can come to appreciate the relationship between trauma and memory in new ways. And that understanding up until now has been somewhat limited. So I was hoping that you could comment on that.
The theories that I read, which mostly came out of the study of, for example, the Holocaust, the Vietnam War, and of course there's a fair bit on the psycho that I talked about, is psychoanalytic tradition, psychoanalytic school that comes out of the turn of the 20th century, Freudian theory. That I find all of this to be extremely, not very satisfying in terms of, because there you can see that there's a clear disjuncture. For example, in the sort of the sort of more of a European, like, trauma theory, when it comes to traumatic memories, right? It's all, there's this idea that, the people with memory loss, so they're the one who traumatized, right? Or if they actually didn't lose the memory, they have trouble dealing with it. It was very hard. So going back on it will be, this memory will become a problem, right? And like I said, I am not saying that the mainlanders, this group of people that I said were displaced, some of them really also show that kind of characteristic. But I think overall, right, there are these other dynamics that are much more important. For example, for a Chinese person coming out of China, living in the first first half of the 20th century, which is what they consider is pretty traumatic, is actually not the loss of memory or the inability to deal with certain memory, but this just the condition of being prevented from going home and not being able to, because in the Western even more of this Western thinking, that because the idea of a loss of memory, or the inability to deal with certain memory in the past, that was considered traumatic, because it encroaches upon an individual's ability to remember the past, right? To become this, so you're not a wholesome subject anymore. You're not in control of your faculty to remember, because your remembrance in your past makes you the person you are right now, right? But I would argue that, in the sort of, at least in the Chinese cultural context back then, and this was very strong back then, and to a certain degree, you can still observe this in China today, and to a certain degree in Taiwan, that and although not so much anymore, the idea that, that one has to have some kind of connection with one's native place, and especially like before 1949, that you when you die, like, you can go work someplace else, right? But when you die, there has to be this sort of repatriation of your remains back to your home village, to be buried with your parents and your ancestor and your lineage, right? That was there. And the inability to do so, or the because that's not always realized, right? For example, the overseas Chinese, that's what they do, like in North America, in Southeast Asia. But this kind of, the repatriation of remain was not possible under a lot of circumstances, right? But the idea that you can do that, but then if it happens that that you can't do that, there is going to be a permanent severance of that relationship. And I argue that that's quite traumatizing, because that means that you are not the person that you will be. It's kind of like very similar to like now you're not a whole person anymore in the Western sense. And this is where memory comes in differently, right? People do remember, and they're trying to remember. And memory becomes a therapeutic thing. So the question is no longer whether these people can remember or cannot remember, or if they can remember, if they can deal with this remembrance, which has been the central problematic of traumatic memory in a lot of Western scholarship. But the central problematic is not this. The central problem then becomes what sort of memory they try to remember, and what function does it serve? What therapeutic function does it serve? And what's the implication, especially the ethical implication of this kind of memory politics?
The memory of the Great Exodus was not the first memory to be recalled by mainlanders who arrived in Taiwan in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Dominic explains that for political reasons, these memories didn't surface publicly until the late 1980s.
the main title of the book is The Great Exodus from China, right? And that particular experience, that it's a refugee experience. It's about this 1 million people escaping to Taiwan, like getting on the last boat, the last plane. It's about seeing their loved ones, getting lost in the separation, and getting to Taiwan knowing that, don't know, whether the remainder of their family that were dispersed during the entire escape route, whether they're alive or not. It was extremely traumatic, right? But it was only a part of their lives in the past. And why, and I made the point in the book that before Taiwan democratized, these stories of 1949 escape didn't come out in the public. Of course, they were in the private conversations, right? If the family, it's like it is said that every mainlander family in Taiwan has a refugee story, right? That they pass down through the generation, but outwardly you can't talk about. And like I said, this is about the selectivity of memory, right? And of course, the most important reason was, before democratization, was political suppression. Because for the nationalist regime, if you talked about 1949 as a refugee movement, as a defeat, then it's no good for the regime, because anyone who has an understanding of nationalist discourse on Taiwan before democratization was that they're going to fight back to China and defeat the communists and take back what they're and so it's this sort of irredentist triumphal regime that predict the final victory, right? So to talk about the defeat and the monument, because 1949 was a huge embarrassment for the nationalist regime. It was a monumental failure. To talk about the suffering that comes from that failure, it was politically a no-no for the national. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why this human migration is never talked about in a serious in any way. There was not a possibility that's going to come out of Taiwan, because no one is talking about it, like outwardly at least.
If the public memory of the Great Exodus was largely suppressed until the late 1980s, memory still played a central role in helping exiled mainlanders cope with their new life in Taiwan. Memory, Dominic explains, is always situational. We draw from past experiences that are most relevant to our current needs and aspirations. During the first decade in Taiwan, the memories that were most pertinent to mainlanders were those of wartime sojourning during the resistance war against Japan.
When they felt that they could still go home, they produced one kind of memory, and that memory was their refugee experience in China during the Japanese invasion, because they can draw a lot of parallels, right? And that was that was also a traumatic memory, but they used that traumatic memory to sort of persuade themselves that we were like that before. We were in Chongqing with the Chiang Kai-shek's government, or in other marginal places in China, in the southwest or in the south, and some of them even went out of the country, right? It's kind of like we're in Taiwan right now, like in Taipei, like in this place, and we don't know the locals because they either speak Japanese or these Chinese dialects that we don't understand, but it's not important. Like when we're in Yunnan province, we don't learn to speak the local dialect, the language of the ethnic minorities either. We don't care about them because we're going back.
By the 1960s, when it became painfully clear that the return to China might never happen, mainlanders turned to memories of their native places to cope with the trauma of the diminishing hope of return. From the 1960s to the 1980s, we see the proliferation of native place associations through magazines and newsletters that featured everything from histories and songs to poems and recipes. These associations were driven by a common desire to preserve as much as their members could remember about their ancestral homelands. Rather than dismissing these projects as pure cultural nostalgia, Dominic stresses that these efforts were part of a process of localization or putting down roots in Taiwan. By finding shared ties with others and devoting significant resources to these ties, mainlanders were investing in Taiwan in very concrete ways as their new home. In some cases, the desire to build ancestral ties led to some very creative reimaginings of the past.
There is this idea still in Taiwan today. Even their children and grandchildren who are born in Taiwan, they will say, well, my grandparents, all throughout their life, they don't think about China, right? Because that's where they're born. That's where they were displaced to Taiwan. So naturally, I mean, they will want unification, throughout their life until they die. I mean, that's they'll never change. I kind of challenge that idea. And that idea is not that hard to understand, isn't it? Like if you spend over a decade or two in a place, and there will be some part of you that's actually connected to this place, right? You live here for decades, and you have a new fam. A lot of them had they left their original family in China, when it was perceived that they might not never go back in their lifetime. I mean, you start a new family in China, right? So naturally, there is going to be some attachment that you actually, develop in this. And this is one of the things, that I discover about the native place association. Not all of the native place association develop this kind of project, but some of them did, and in a very sort of curious and ostensible way. They were just like, for example, the Shanxi province community that I talked about in the book. They have this person, kind of like an armchair historian / anthropologist. I mean, his name is Xu Bingyan. I mean, he was just a low-level government official in the education bureau, and his job is basically to he moves around on the island, really go into the countryside and oversee the operation of public schools on a daily basis, right? So he could be in one county and next day in the other county. So he's like, so he went into a lot of places, like the rural Taiwanese places where a lot of mainlanders living in cities back in those days would go into. And he just happened to discover, I mean, this discovery was made in 1976. His discovery as, a archaeologist / anthropologist / amateur historian. And he made this claim that, the province where he came from, right? The Shanxi province, there were Shanxi migrants that came to Taiwan previously in history. They came as part of the military migration that came over with this historical figure called Guo Xingda. He's pretty famous in Chinese and Taiwanese history. Long story short, he was actually a pirate that turned into a Ming loyalist. His Chinese name was Zheng Chenggong, right? and so there were a contingent of his soldier fought under this general from Shanxi province, and it was presumed that the soldiers that came over with him from the mainland were also Shanxi is soldiers from Shanxi province. Although we do have some documentary evidence, but very, very slim. There's really, we don't really know. But then, the question then becomes, why would this mainlander person, a low-level official, went into a Taiwanese countryside and went into obviously a Hokkien speaking local Taiwanese community. It was deep in the, like not deep in the mountains, but beside the mountains in the middle of nowhere in central Taiwan. And says that this community of people, because the name of the village was called Shanxi Village. It's the same name, the same character with his home province. It's not only the pronunciation is the same as the same two characters, Shanxi. So it's called the Shanxi Village. And so he did some kind of work looking at tombstones in that region, and then he determined that these people that are about 300 or 400 peasants living in that village, and they farm the land in that particular area. He made a determination that through his archaeological field work that these people were the descendants of that particular contingent of Shanxi soldiers who came over with Koxinga maybe 200 years ago or something. And then and they managed to, and so that site became, from 1977 to right around 1982, I think, became a site of pilgrimage of Shanxi provincials living in different parts of Taiwan. Like these are provincial that belongs to the Shanxi Native Place Associations, right? And there are other instances, like the Hunan people from Hunan were remembered in this group of soldiers who defended Taiwan against the French during the Sino-French War, and they're like some group from Hebei were like fighting this very similar kind of connections of Hebei people who had moved to Taiwan before that. So of course, all of these is like, when you look at this is all fictive, right? But why were people, like group of mainland people, mainlanders, and they're separated by different provinces because their subnational identity is still their provincial identity. Why were they doing this? And my interpretation is that there starts to be some kind of, I call it localization of the roots. And there was also a movement among them, the first generation mainlanders at the time, in right around the same time when they're trying to find, their predecessors in Taiwan that had moved to Taiwan before them. It's called the movement to produce genealogy. Like, if you know anything about Chinese culture, like genealogy is the kind of thing that you need to establish your line, right? Like, a lot of the lines that got pushed back too far, like the 6th or 7th generation, or even to the Han Dynasty, those are really fictive ones. But the act of producing this genealogy, the genealogy of they being the first generation from their province and from their county who moved to Taiwan and established a new branch of family, right? That movement, which I talked about a little bit in the book, also coincide with this movement of local root changing, the root seeking in Taiwanese villages, right?
By the time you get to the 1980s, larger political changes brought this era of native place associations to an end. It was no longer necessary to create fictive genealogies, because under Deng Xiaoping, China opened, and it became possible to return home. In Taiwan, Chiang Ching-kuo, who assumed leadership of the ruling Nationalist Party after the death of his father, Chiang Kai-shek, moved in the direction of democratization and ended the 40-year ban on travel to China. Despite this decision, Dominic explains that the journey home was still extremely difficult. But even more difficult than the journey home was the trauma returnees experienced when they finally made it back to their native places.
You have to go through all these obstacles that were, like I said, you can't go directly. You got to register through the Red Cross because the ROC government, in theory, still did not recognize the PRC government. For the ROC government, PRC government didn't actually exist. It's all these like legal constitutional barriers and is not negotiable for the nationalist regime, right? And they're kind of like, and so then if you're regular people, you need to be put through all of these, and they're used to it, right? But it's kind of like after and a lot of people got scammed in Hong Kong because there are people making this, doing this kind of thing for money, taking people to China, in Hong Kong, taking you back to your villages because back in the days, late 1980s China, early 1990s China, it was not a pleasant place to visit, right? It was still, they're developing, but it's kind of like if you go to some of their villages, some of the rural villages in China today are still pretty bad and pretty depressed. And this is not to mention that, this is the beginning of the reform and opening. And so the returnees, so it's really enough hard for them to enter China. And especially for those, disadvantaged old soldiers at the bottom of the social order to really come up with the money, right? And then you really got to have a lot of money because when you return, you want to be able to give money to your mainland relatives, and of course later on this becomes something that is really not good in terms of reestablishing that relationship, and also just all kinds of things, because
you're mentioning changing your name, tattoos,
yes.
all these complex family ties. That part I thought was fascinating. It's not just getting a ticket and going on a plane and reuniting.
Yeah. The family thing is the most difficult one. If you're talking about like you've had a tattoo that says kill Chairman Mao, I mean, that's okay because that tattoo can be removed, right? You just have to be really, really patient. You wait in line for laser removal, and you want to borrow money from your friends. And a lot of them, those are in the government. A lot of them were in the government and in the military still serving. They have to quit their jobs in order for them to return, until the law changes in the mid 1990s. Before that, if you want to go, you can't be, serving in the military and in the government in any capacity. So they have to take an early retirement, which is the financial sacrifice. But
major sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
So that guilt and that need to go back. Tremendous.
It was very strong, but then all of these obstacles, can be dealt with. It's traumatizing, but can be. But there is one obstacle that are particularly traumatizing, like double families, because a lot of them, when they remarry in Taiwan, they lie about the status of their family in China. Because if you said to a Taiwanese girl, "Hey, I still have a wife in China. You're like, maybe in 3 years I'm gonna return to China and then see you, adios." I mean, do you think this Taiwan girl will marry you, have children with you? No.
So there are a lot of families that must end up getting destroyed at that point in time. There's a reckoning.
Yeah. Is the mainland husband just, in order to return, right? They have to say officially on the document. This have to not only be reported to the government, they have to really come clean to their Taiwan family, saying that, you know what, I lied to you, honey. Sorry, I lied to you. My former wife, which I tell you died in the Chinese Civil War. You know what? You're still alive, and I still have 2 children there, and now I'm going to see them. So what would your Taiwanese family, your wife and your children here, what would they feel? I mean, I would, and this is extremely common back then.
So once you go through all of that effort, exhaust your resources, deal with all the family complications, and then you get there, and what's the final shock that greets people?
Well, lots of things, but in short, is that you found out that your home, your native place, your village, the place you grew up, is no longer that place that you remember. It's completely different. And it's extremely alienating and extremely, like I said, disorienting and traumatic. because this is the place you want to return, and the people that you want to see in that place, right? For the longest time. And yet what greeted you is like you have this sense, and that sense is extremely strong, and it's across the board for most, I would say 99% of the returnees from Taiwan felt this way. Like, I no longer feel at home in a place that I thought was my home and my belonging. Right? Like I said, there are lots of things like you can't get used to the way in which your family member, like your sibling, like when they return, a lot of your parents' generation already die, right? And what you have is your siblings or your cousins, and they are speaking in language that you don't really understand. Like, they're talking about German now, they're talking about like the proletariat, like all these like giant, the daily language thing and the practice, because a lot of the returnees from Taiwan, one of the things they wanted to do is to seek that ancestral grave, that and they want to pay their respect. They brought in a lot of capital to be able to, like, a lot of people like just that's all they want to do. But then you're told that all the graves were, a lot of them were destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. They were dug up. And then it was actually the reaction of your Chinese family. A lot of them were like, well, like, we don't do those things anymore. This is, like Chairman Mao said, this is all like, superstition, right? We're now a new China. This is, we will do this for you because you are, my dear cousin who returned from Taiwan. Yeah, we'll do this for you, but we ourselves don't do this anymore. And of course, like, I am not trying to basically say that the mainland side was not traumatized. They were also traumatized, because just by the fact that you had family member who went to Taiwan, just by the fact it doesn't matter. Like, he was kidnapped by the nationalist army, yeah, whatever. But he's there with Chiang Kai-shek, right? You're one of the nationalist group of people, right? And if you're that, then during the Cultural Revolution, you're going to have a pretty hard time. You're going to get struggled against. You're the one who gets struggled against in the village, right? And during the famine, on the Great Leap Four, you're the ones that you're the household that get the last bit of food to eat. If there's no food to eat for you, then there's no food to eat. Well, too bad, but you're counter-revolutionaries, right? And so for these people to receive the returnees in this way, that, hey, you know what? Now, hey, you return from Taiwan, you have a lot of money. Now is the time for you to sort of pay me back that, all of the suffering, that as a compensation. Right. And then, you want to do the ancestral grave thing. That's good. I can arrange it for you. You give me money, but what about me, the person who are still alive? I mean, it is, under the circumstances, it's really easy to understand why this sort of, coming face to face with the real homeland was so traumatic for the exile.
The trauma of the return home to China was then compounded when mainlander exiles came back to a new Taiwan that was being transformed by the process of democratization. At the very moment mainlander exiles were ready to fully embrace Taiwan as their new home, Taiwan was undergoing radical changes, making it a much less welcoming place.
First of all, there is this realization, that, okay, now, like, me and my children, we now belong to Taiwan, to this side, right? It is still called Republic of China. And maybe in the future, there will be some kind of unification with China, but not now. Maybe not in my lifetime, because two sides are so different, right? But then they quickly found out they have to fight for their place in Taiwan, because increasingly, with the way in which the politics goes, the mainlander as an entire group was soon perceived as, part of the, because if you democratize, right? And there's going to be a lot of criticism, at least at the beginning, towards the old nationalist regime, that authoritarian regime that suppressed the people. And then, yeah, you are the group of people who came over that regime that staffed its civil service and the army, like the mainlanders in comparison to local Taiwanese. You are a minority, but you are in a position of power for the longest time. You guys are dominant as a group in the Nationalist Party. I mean, so you can sort of imagine the kind of thing that goes on, in a following, right?
It was in reaction to this backlash toward the mainlander population by native-born Taiwanese that we see the explosion of memories of the Great Exodus. These are stories not told by mainlander exiles themselves, but by their Taiwan-born children and grandchildren who use these memories to stake their own claim to Taiwan as their home. But even before this, Dominic explains, the children of mainlander exiles were already busy with their own memory work during the 1970s and 1980s, recalling the people and places that were meaningful in their own lives.
So the first generation were still, their way of localization or Taiwanization, or maybe I should not call it Taiwanization, because it was actually not Taiwanization. It was just localize themselves, right? So that's the first generation. It is through their native place network and through these temporal and root-seeking project. But their children, who were the first generation born in Taiwan by the 1970s, late 1970s, a lot of them already, came out and start, writing novels and start being part of the producers of memories. And these people move into, want to focus on the old soldiers, because they're this marginalized group of people who are also mainlanders, so you sympathize with them. And also the military family village. These are the places that a lot of them grew up in, right? And in the late 1970s and early 80s, the nationalist government came up with a scheme of urban renewal. And this is all throughout the island. They are going to knock down these old neighborhoods that were built. Some of them were not built in the 50s, right? They were like just old Japanese facilities and dormitories. And they're older. So they're, by the time you get there, it's already very old. But even the new ones that were built in the 1950s were really badly built and flimsy. And that's because, 1950s, the idea was that they were going to go back to China. So these lands are on valuable prime land in the cities right now, because back then the city was very small. And the military would just take over different sections on the fringe of the cities and build these called the military family or military dependence village to house their family, right? But now, and there are up to 900 of these all across the island. And now these villages, they're on, some of them fairly large, and they're government land. And the residents, they do not own the property. They do not own the rights. So there's a way of urban renewal to knock down these villages and build high-rise apartments. And then not only you can sell these apartments to the local Taiwan residents, but also the original residents can get a unit or two as well. But because of these schemes, because it's for the people who grew up in these community, they see this as a sort of a way sort of erasing their, because like I said, this is where the intergenerational memory, you can see the dynamics, right? The Taiwan-born mainlanders, although their parents trying to give all these memories to them about their hometowns, and to a certain degree, they accept that memory, and they thought themselves being, coming from Shandong province in China as a Shandong person. But in actuality, they grew up in Taiwan, in these villages, and they have a lot of childhood memory in these villages, right? So when governments start knocking down these villages, they want some sort of preservation, because they don't want their past on the island to be sort of erased. And then this process just intensified after democratization, because it's now the second and third generation mainlander will be like, yeah, so they're into the history and the preservation of military family villages. If you come to Taiwan right now, you see that in almost all major cities, there are usually one or even several of these like former military family villages that are converted to museums. They are tourist sites. They're tourist sites. The biggest one is right beside the building the landmark building 101 Taipei 101. It was called the Sisinan Village. That's the biggest and the most famous one. And that one's right beside the landmark building of Taipei today. But all throughout Liana, you have a lot. And the reason why I said that there's a transformation, moving on to this, the memory of 1949 as displacement, is that although the old soldier memory or the stories of old soldier and the stories of military family village were already flowing publicly, they became part of this larger discussion of the 1949 trauma because of democratization, because of the going back to China experience, because of coming back to Taiwan and being displaced again as a person, right? Being traumatized and being displaced, of trying to find a belonging again. And they step on the military family village preservation thing. They step on the narratives of the old soldiers, because these two types of communities would not have existed if not for the original 1949. So this is where everything comes together. And this is why I said that, if you look at this way, the correct way to read why they're producing the 1949 memory after democratization, and it was really the second and the Taiwan-born generation that are actually producing this memory, is because they want to be Taiwanese. They want to become part of Taiwan. Now, they can still, have more favorable view to unify with China. I mean, that remains to be, and they could have, favorable view of Chiang Kai-shek's, Chiang Ching-kuo's legacy, and more favorable view of the past authoritarian period, right? But one thing that's I think it's beyond doubt. It's their identity. Taiwan is something that they will identify to. Otherwise, they won't produce this 1949 memory. In fact, the production of 1949 memory, the way in which they tell it, right, and its connection to old soldiers and military family village, is to say that we are also Taiwanese. We were born here. We just have a different history compared to other Taiwanese. And you know what? We're not colonizers. If you want us to call us colonizer, that's your perspective. But from our perspective, our parents and grandparents were refugees from, like you were migrants, like a majority of Taiwanese were migrants from China. We just moved here at a different time. We have as much as a stake and as much as right to be in this place, just like you. We're part of the new imagined community of post-liberalization Taiwan. And I think that at the end of the day is why the descendants of the original migrants are producing this memory at this time.
In his conclusion, Dominic reveals that he was conflicted about taking on this project because he himself is a member of the native-born Chinese population in Taiwan. Through his research, he discovered the details of how his own relatives suffered at the hands of the nationalist government. His initial interest was to better understand how mainlander Chinese refugees could fail to recognize the suffering they had inflicted upon the native-born Chinese in Taiwan.
One of the initial goals was to really find out, to understand why, because I've seen a lot of these traumatic narratives and self-portrayal as victims of the Civil War. I just really want to understand how could a group of people being so blind, like even after democratization with all the information coming out, so blind to the fact that, collectively as a group, they sort of rule over and displace the local Taiwanese, if not politically, at least socially and culturally, right? And there's this sense of historical injustice. And I was, for a period of time, pretty indignant. Then I really went into the research. I do a lot of interviews first, but then this is followed by, reading a huge amount of oral history, because there were really a lot. And then you go into the archival research itself and trying to, in fact, the reason why I got into archival research in the first place is I want to basically check upon facts. I know, I kind of know back then people's memory is kind of like, not very reliable. They will tell you certain things. They will tell you the things that they want to tell you now, right? And that you remember now, but they'll forget a whole bunch of things, especially for people who want to basically cover up their tracks, right? So, but then all of this turns into some kind of, when it really becomes like, there comes to a point that I realized that this is real trauma. This is what we're talking about here. Is not a group of people trying to cover up their tracks. If you sort of look at the kind of, experience that they went through coming here, you kind of look at their longing for home, which is all real. They're not really trying to make all of this up. And you put yourself in those circumstances, you'll be like, yeah, I would see that, it's kind of difficult for them to imagine that their own displacement also displace other people.
Through his research on the memories of mainlander refugees and their descendants, Dominic was able to overcome some of the preconceptions, pain, and resentment from his own family's past. Dedicating his book to his family and the people of Taiwan, Dominic hopes that his scholarship might foster a greater degree of understanding and empathy between communities still at odds over the past.
I am not saying that it's an easy process. Right? This process, because I am just a single person. Right? I've been through this journey. It's a really hard journey, and I write this book the way I've written. The way in which I've written is to, of course, first of all, I said in the dedication of the book, this is for my family and the people of Taiwan. For them to people of my background to read this and just to see, hey, you know what? These are, I know you don't like the mainlanders. I know you've been unfairly treated, and you were unfairly, like your predecessor were really unfairly treated, right? But this is why they can't think of this. It's very difficult for them to think about it, and we need and for a mainlander person to read this, it will be kind of like, oh, so if he or she can get the message, it'll be like, oh, so that all the stuff that I know about my community, it was kind of selected through this kind of process. And of course, I still feel the residual effect of this traumatization. And but this is there is such a convoluted history behind where we got to this point. And so it is something really to think about.
Since the 1950s, mainlander refugees have been using their memory work to maintain ties to their ancestral homes and to forge new connections to Taiwan. In contrast to the Western understanding of trauma as a singular event affecting the individual, in Taiwan, we see how a particular community experienced multiple traumas. We see how memory was never lost or in need of repair. In Taiwan, it was the mainlander community that drew selectively from the past to maintain or build new connections to home. The need and the possibility of telling the story of the Great Exodus only came in the 1980s, 40 years after the original experience. It was a story told not by the first generation, but by their children and grandchildren as a means of establishing their own roots in Taiwan. Understanding this story and the decades of memory work preceding it could be a means of mitigating hostilities and bridging the divide between long-warring communities in Taiwan. I would like to thank Dominic for so generously sharing his time with me, especially as our interview took place with a significant time difference while he was on his research sabbatical in Taipei. I would also like to thank Dominic for sharing a number of his photos, which I have featured on the podcast Instagram, Twitter, Facebook pages, and website. Next month, we turn to the memory of Stalin. I talk with Todd Nelson about how Stalin's memory was rehabilitated during the Putin years. The militarism we see in Russia today is in no small way due to the selective remembering of Stalin. Please review us on your favorite podcast app and follow us on Twitter or Instagram for updates. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Realms of Memory.